On Wednesday, December 4th, 1872, a Nova Scotia brig known as De Gratia spotted a vessel drifting aimlessly on the horizon. Now, at first, the crew didn't think much of it, but as they continued to observe, the captain grew concerned and suspected the ship was in distress. As the unknown vessel sort of came closer, the captain couldn't see anyone on the deck of this ship, and despite his repeated attempts to call out, there was never a response. Since there was no reply, the captain was certain something was wrong but wanted to proceed cautiously. He instructed a few men to row a lifeboat over to investigate the ship, and as they approached, they saw the ship's name, Mary Celeste, on the stern. Climbing aboard, they discovered a mysterious and pretty chilling scene because the vessel was completely abandoned with no one on board. Now, there was some damage to the sails and the hull of the ship, but there was nothing too serious. Similarly, there was some water in the hold, but not enough to really be concerning. Despite the light damage, the men found no significant weather damage, signs of a struggle, or any reason an experienced captain would abandon this ship. More mysteriously, the crew had left all of their belongings, including foul weather gear and items that wouldn't typically be abandoned, even if there was an emergency. A log found aboard the ship hadn't been updated since November 25th, which was 9 days before the ship was discovered. On that day, the Mary Celeste was just off the coast of Santa Maria Island, which was nearly 450 miles from where it was found on December 4th. Once the men returned to the De Gratia, they reported their findings to the captain. Realizing the Mary Celeste was abandoned with all its cargo still aboard, the captain decided to transport the ship to Gibraltar to report it as a derelict and claim a share of the salvage profits. Now, unfortunately for the crew of the De Gratia, their hopes of profiting from the salvage were overshadowed by numerous theories about the reported fate of the Mary Celeste's crew. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the Mary Celeste's origins, her intended route during the doomed voyage, the members of her crew, the eventual discovery of the ship, the controversy and confusion surrounding the salvage hearings, and then finally we'll discuss the many theories proposed throughout the last century and a half that this mystery has lived on. As always, as I always do, near the end of the video, I'll discuss which theory I believe is the most likely, but with that being said, join me as we take a more in-depth look at the Mary Celeste and the mysterious disappearance of her crew. The construction of the Mary Celeste was finished in early May 1861, and it launched on May 18th. However, at the time, she flew under a different name. Initially, she was called the Amazon. Now, most of her construction was completed on the shore of Spencer's Island in Nova Scotia. Joshua Dewis, who was the main constructor behind the Amazon and the first owner of the vessel, sailed the Amazon to Parsboro to sign the vessel's registration, which made her official. The Amazon's maiden voyage occurred sometime in June 1861, and its intended destination was supposed to be London. However, the ship that would one day become the Mary Celeste made it very apparent very early that it had misfortune ingrained into its soul. The captain of the Amazon's maiden voyage was a man named Robert McClellan, who was a co-owner of the vessel. So the Amazon was set to ship a load of timber from Five Islands, Nova Scotia, across the Atlantic to London. As McClellan watched men load the timber on board the Amazon, he informed a crew member that he'd been battling a cold over the last few days, but he kind of figured that some time at sea would cure his illness. Once the Amazon's cargo was loaded and secured, McClellan and the crew boarded her. However, it was almost as if the ship itself worsened McClellan's condition, because his cold escalated to full-on pneumonia as soon as he stepped aboard the ship. Now, during this time, pneumonia was basically a death sentence, being the third leading cause of death worldwide in the 1800s. Despite the well-known mortality rate of this disease at the time, McClellan figured he'd still be able to finish the voyage, and the Amazon set off from Five Islands. Over the following few hours, McClellan grew weaker and weaker before eventually becoming completely bedridden, at which point the crew knew that the captain was doomed. So the Amazon reversed course just before it was about to exit the Bay of Fundy, and the following day, the Amazon arrived at Spencer's Island and McClellan was taken to the home of Jacob Spicer, who was yet another shareholder of the Amazon. When he reached this home, McClellan continued to just get worse and worse, and eventually ended up passing away 2 days later. Jacob Spicer's son, George, accompanied the crew of the Amazon to deliver McClellan's body to his hometown of Economy, Nova Scotia. And as the Amazon pulled into port in Economy, George noticed that a woman was sprinting across the beach towards them. Upon landing, George spoke to the woman and learned her name was Mary Ann McClellan, who was Robert McClellan's newlywed wife. When the ship was approaching, Mary Ann recognized it as the Amazon, which she knew was a newly built ship that was set to be captained by her husband. Of course, the vessel's voyage across the Atlantic would take months, and Mary Ann figured she wouldn't see her husband or the Amazon until early 1863. You know, considering it had only been a week since the Amazon had set sail, she knew something had gone wrong. George delivered her the unfortunate news of her husband's passing, and for the rest of his life, George Spicer claimed to be almost haunted by the memory of Mary Ann running across the beach and at the sight of her heartbreaking when he told her the news. And within just the first week, the vessel suffered its first tragedy. A week or so after Robert McClellan's death, Demise hired a man named Jack Parker to serve as the Amazon's new captain. Parker was from Walton, Nova Scotia, which was located just across the Bay of Fundy from Economy. And with Parker now in control, the Amazon set off again for London. But again, the Amazon could barely make it out of the Bay of Fundy without some sort of issue. So the vessel was meant to make a stop in Eastport, Maine, before heading off to London. But when the Amazon left port when she left port in Maine, she struck a row of they're called fishing weirs, which are basically like these wood spikes. I'm sure I'll put a picture of it up on here. They're like wooden spikes that are almost to be like some sort of trap for fish. The boat hit those, which those sticks did enough damage to the ship that they had to immediately turn back around to Eastport for repairs, which then delayed them another couple of weeks. Now, once the Amazon was repaired, it set off once again, and luckily this time, the remainder of the voyage to London went off without a hitch. The same couldn't be said, however, about the voyage back. So, after the lumber was delivered to London, the Amazon accidentally rammed another vessel in the Strait of Dover. Now, how you accidentally run into another ship on the ocean is just baffling to me. But anyways, the damage dealt by the Amazon was severe enough that the other vessel sank almost immediately after they impacted each other. So the crew of the Amazon then rescued all the sailors from the other vessel and pulled into port at Dover to drop off the sailors and repair the Amazon. And of course, this again delayed the Amazon for another few weeks. But once the Amazon was repaired, she sailed back to Nova Scotia safely, and her string of bad luck on her maiden voyage appeared to kind of come to an end. Now, after Amazon's eventful first voyage, it simply just became another vessel involved in the popular trade of the 1800s. Now, in November of 1861, Parker commissioned an artist to paint the Amazon, which is the only illustration of what the future Mary Celeste may have looked like. So it turns out I was actually wrong about this, because there is a photo of the Mary Celeste when she's actually known as the Mary Celeste. The photo that I'm sure is on screen right now, it is just after the mysterious disappearance had happened. But it is a very haunting picture, and it's only made even weirder because nobody knows exactly where that picture was taken either. I mean, it has been confirmed that that is the Mary Celeste, but the location of where that picture was taken has never really been known, and no one ever claimed any sort of credit for it. It just, someone took the picture and it ended up in a newspaper, and whoever took it, wherever it was taken, was completely lost to time. So it makes this story even more haunting, and you'll see why as we go through the rest of this video. Parker continued to captain the ship until 1863, when he left to captain another vessel. Parker was succeeded by a man named William Thompson, who was another shareholder of the Amazon, and he served as the captain for about 5 years before having a falling out with Joshua Dewis. Now, what Thompson didn't know was that Dewis had been looking to replace him for a while, but Dewis never really got the chance because in October 1867, Thompson sailed the Amazon to Cape Breton Island to retrieve a shipment of coal he planned to sell somewhere along the east coast of America. However, the town where the Amazon docked, known as Big Glace Bay, was subject to harsh winds in the fall and winter. So after docking, the Amazon was hit by a gale wind that blew the ship right up onto the rocky shore of Big Glace Bay. Of course, the ship was severely damaged, and the crew just left it stranded on the rocks. And unlike the previous times the Amazon had been damaged, Dewis and his co-owners couldn't really afford to fix the Amazon this time. So Dewis decided to just sell the Amazon to a local in Cape Breton, and that seller ended up selling the Amazon a month later, and it changed hands a few more times until November 1868, when a man named Richard Haynes purchased the Amazon at auction for only $1,700. Now, that's cheap now, but I don't have the exact conversion. I might throw it up over here, what this might be converted to nowadays. But even for this time, the 1750 was pretty cheap because this was only about a third of what the ship was worth upon her launch. While the price he paid for the Amazon was indeed a steal, he eventually had to pay over 5 times that sale price to repair the ship. Once the ship was repaired, Haynes appointed himself as captain and renamed the vessel the Mary Celeste, which pretty much meant Heavenly Mary. Shortly after the renaming, the Mary Celeste was seized by creditors because Haynes had failed to pay off any of the loans he'd received to repair the vessel. So in October 1869, the Mary Celeste once again went to auction, where it was sold to a company headed by a man named James Winchester. After Winchester took ownership of the Mary Celeste, it underwent multiple modifications over the next few years. Now, I won't bore you with measurements, but just know pretty much every aspect of the ship had been enlarged. By October 1872, the Mary Celeste was ready to set sail, and a man named Benjamin Briggs would be her new captain. Benjamin Briggs was born in Wareham, Massachusetts on April 24th, 1835. Now, much like Benjamin would eventually become, his father Nathan was an experienced sailor and captain. From the time they were young, Nathan had been training Benjamin and his brothers to eventually go to sea. In his teenage years, Benjamin served as a deckhand aboard various ships, and when he was 20, he served as a hand aboard the Hope, which was a ship that Nathan Briggs captained. Despite being the captain's son, Benjamin had no real interest in favoritism, and did pretty much everything any other sailor would do. This actually served to Benjamin's advantage, because he quickly earned the respect of his peers, and soon found himself aboard the Seafoam. Soon after joining the crew of the Seafoam, Benjamin became the ship's captain. And after serving as captain of the Seafoam for a couple of years, Benjamin purchased his very own ship, which he called the Forest King. In 1862, Benjamin returned to Massachusetts to marry his first cousin, Sarah Cobb. Now, as unusual as that might seem, you gotta remember what era we're kind of talking about here. So, yeah, a little bit more common than it is today. But from their childhood, Benjamin and Sarah were described as soulmates. After their marriage, Benjamin and Sarah honeymooned aboard the Forest King in the Mediterranean. Now, from that point forward, Sarah actually accompanied Benjamin on multiple voyages, until she actually became pregnant a few years later. In 1865, Benjamin returned to Massachusetts after Sarah gave birth to their son, Arthur. When Arthur was finally old enough to travel, he and Sarah accompanied Benjamin on one of his ships, but they only really joined him for one voyage before they returned home while Benjamin still remained at sea. Now, 5 years later, in October of 1870, Sarah gave birth to a girl named Sophia. The birth of his daughter pushed Benjamin further away for his sort of past excitement for life on the sea. This was amplified by the fact that 2 years before Sophia's birth, Nathan Briggs died in a freak accident. Now, Benjamin Briggs was not a superstitious man at all, and knew the risks of his profession, but in some ways, it seemed like the Briggs family may have been cursed. Multiple members of the Briggs family and close family friends had died at sea from various causes. Now, some succumbed to disease, others perished in sailing accidents, and even those who sort of survived their tenure on the sea seemed to have an unusual number of close calls with death. Nathan Briggs's death is probably one of the oddest to befall the family, because his death didn't come from the sea, because he had already retired. Instead, Nathan was at home when a thunderstorm rolled by, and while he stood in the frame of his front door, sort of just kind of watching the storm, a bolt of lightning struck the metal frame of the door, which electrocuted Nathan and killed him instantly. So after Nathan's death, Benjamin and his brother Oliver began discussing retiring. Oliver was another member of the Briggs family who experienced an unusual number of close calls. But also, Oliver was very similar to Benjamin in that he also had a growing family and was losing his desire for seafaring. So at first, the brothers planned to purchase a storefront in New Bedford, Massachusetts, but it was bought before they could even make an offer. In 1872, Oliver purchased a vessel named the Julia A. Halleck, which he planned to complete one voyage on before selling it and officially retiring from sailing. Benjamin, on the other hand, purchased a large share in the Mary Celeste, owned by James Winchester. Now, Benjamin was good friends with Winchester and had actually sailed aboard other Winchester vessels in the past. Unlike Oliver, Benjamin thought the Mary Celeste could sort of reignite his passion for seafaring, and the main reason Benjamin invested in the Mary Celeste and eventually agreed to captain her was because of the structural changes that were made to the vessel. As I sort of mentioned earlier, every aspect of the ship had been enlarged, but that also included the captain's quarters. Additionally, while the ship had been enlarged since its stint as the Amazon, it was still a relatively small vessel compared to other sort of trade ships of the time. This also enticed Benjamin because since the Mary Celeste was smaller, it meant it was faster and had way smaller deliveries, which would basically equate to less time at sea. Considering the expansion of the living quarters and the size of the Mary Celeste, Benjamin agreed to captain the vessel and decided he would bring Sarah and Sophie with him. They did kind of consider bringing Arthur, but by this time Arthur was already in school and was doing exceptionally well, so Benjamin and Sarah just decided to leave Arthur in the care of his grandmother while they were away. So on October 19th, 1872, Benjamin Briggs left his home in Marion, Massachusetts en route to New York City to supervise the loading of the Mary Celeste, and Sarah and Sophie would join him a week later. Benjamin arrived at Pier 50 in New York on October 20th, 1872, and from the very moment he saw her, he loved the Mary Celeste. In a letter he sent to his mother, Benjamin claimed that the Mary Celeste was in beautiful trim, which I guess is sailor speak for it's pretty. In the same letter, Benjamin told his mother that he hoped the ship would have a fine passage. For the Mary Celeste's maiden voyage, she was set to deliver 1,700 barrels of alcohol to Genoa, Italy. Or Genoa. I'm not Italian, so I don't know. As Benjamin watched the cargo being stored on the ship, he was accompanied by Winchester, who shared in Benjamin's excitement to launch the Mary Celeste. However, in what may have been a sort of bad omen, Winchester noticed that one of the vessel's lifeboats was heavily damaged and would be impossible to use. So that lifeboat was taken from the ship, which left the Mary Celeste with only one lifeboat for the voyage. Now, supposedly Winchester had ordered another lifeboat to replace the one that they took off, but it never arrived before the Mary Celeste set sail. After the lifeboat was removed, Winchester introduced Benjamin to his crew. The ship's first mate was a man named Albert Richardson. Richardson, who was another stockholder in the Mary Celeste, was already well acquainted with Benjamin. Richardson was also an established sailor, and he and Benjamin had sailed together on previous vessels, and they had a pretty strong friendship together. The remainder of the Celeste's crew weren't particularly notable, but were, according to a letter from Sarah Briggs, extremely capable for the job. Speaking of Sarah, she and Sophia arrived in New York on October 27th, 1872. Benjamin welcomed them both aboard the Mary Celeste and led them to their quarters. Now, over the following week, nothing really noteworthy happened until November 2nd, 1872, when the crew finished loading the Mary Celeste. 2 days later, Benjamin received signed papers from Winchester and delivered them to the courthouse, which approved the Mary Celeste's voyage. Before returning to the ship, Benjamin mailed what would be his final letter to his mother. And in the letter, Benjamin said that the last week had been stressful and chaotic, but he had managed to adjust. And he ended the letter by saying that the Mary Celeste would depart on November 5th, 1872. Now, before the ship departed, Benjamin spoke to multiple people on the waterfront. Initially, he was actually looking for Oliver in the hope that he'd have a contract in New York. Unfortunately, though, Benjamin never found Oliver, but did run into some other people he knew. One of them was a Nova Scotia native named David Morehouse. Much like Benjamin, Morehouse was a veteran of the waves and captained his very own vessel. The two had met multiple times in their travels and had formed a pretty decent friendship. Morehouse's vessel, the Dei Gratia, was also destined for Genoa, but wouldn't ship out for another 2 weeks. Now, knowing that they were going to the same place and how long ships usually dock in places in this time, Benjamin and Morehouse agreed to meet up again once they were both in Genoa. So, on the morning of November 5th, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed from Pier 50 and entered New York Harbor. However, almost immediately after the ship entered the harbor, the sky darkened and a heavy storm appeared. At first, Benjamin wanted to just tough it out and begin the voyage anyway, but he eventually changed his mind, and the Mary Celeste anchored just off of Staten Island, where the vessel would remain for the following 2 days as the storm continued. Now, while they were just kind of sitting around for those 2 days, Sarah sent what would also be her final letter to her mother-in-law. And in this letter, Sarah described the storm, the delay, and Sophia's longing to see her grandmother again. Once the sky cleared on November 7th, the Mary Celeste was guided out of the harbor by a pilot ship. And after the vessel was safely out of the harbor, the captain of the pilot ship took Sarah's letter to be mailed and bid the crew farewell. That pilot would be the last person to see any of the members of the Mary Celeste's crew ever again. A week or so later, Oliver arrived in New York aboard the Julia A. Halleck and was informed that the Mary Celeste had already set sail for Genoa. Shortly after Oliver's arrival, on November 15th, 1872, the Dei Gratia set sail for Genoa, following the same general route that the Mary Celeste had taken 8 days earlier. On Wednesday, December 4th, 1872, the Dei Gratia was halfway between a set of islands known as the Azores and mainland Portugal. At the rate that they were traveling, Captain David Morehouse believed that they would reach Gibraltar within the week. From Gibraltar, the Dei Gratia was set to retrieve the remainder of its cargo destined for Genoa, and although the Dei Gratia would only rest for a few days while waiting for the cargo to be loaded, Morehouse and the rest of the crew were ready for any sort of reprieve from the sea. So, suffice to say, the crew was in pretty high spirits. Around 1:30 p.m. that day, after checking on his crew, Morehouse was sort of just leaning against the portside railing when he spotted a ship on the horizon. From his guess, he estimated this vessel was probably about 6 miles away, and at first, he didn't really think much of it. I mean, it's just another ship on the water. However, as he continued to kind of just look at this ship, he got this sort of sense that something may have been wrong with it. So Morehouse grabbed a spyglass for a better look, and his suspicions were well placed because he noticed the ship was barely flying her sails. According to later testimony from Morehouse, there was only a light breeze at the time, which meant any ship would almost certainly be at full sail, trying to catch any sort of wind possible. This was more than enough to convince Morehouse that something could be wrong on that ship, so he directed his helmsman to turn towards the vessel. 20 or so minutes later, Morehouse estimated they were now within 4 miles of the mystery ship. He continued to sort of just watch the ship through the spyglass, and he soon noticed something else even more concerning, and that was that the boat was sailing aimlessly and seemed to only be guided by the waves. Around 2 p.m., Morehouse called his first mate Oliver DeVoe up top to get a second opinion of the vessel, and Just like Morehouse, DeVoe knew something was off. Both men gathered the crew and informed them that they were going to investigate the mystery ship. At 3 p.m., the De Gratia was about 400 yards from the vessel, and yet again there was proof that something was amiss. Both Morehouse and DeVoe failed to spot anyone aboard this vessel, and they also noticed that one of the ship's sails was heavily tattered. After this, Morehouse instructed DeVoe to take a lifeboat with 2 other men to investigate. And once they got the lifeboat up onto the ship, the first thing that the men noticed was that the hull of this ship was in very good condition, but looked like it may have seen some rough weather. Additionally, the rudder of the ship was practically in perfect condition, which only made its irregular movements stranger. As the men reached the stern of the ship and spotted the name engraved there, they learned the mystery vessel was named the Mary Celeste. The men pulled the lifeboat alongside the Celeste, and DeVoe, along with one of the other 2 men, climbed aboard her. Almost immediately, they knew something was off because it was eerily quiet. Besides, the typical sounds of a ship on the sea, there were no signs of life at all. The wheel of the ship was turning in accordance with waves impacting the rudder, pieces of the ship's sails were scattered on the deck, a portion of railing from the port side lay on the deck, and a door leading to a section of living quarters continuously and ominously swung open and slammed shut as the ship swayed. DeVoe called out to anyone who may have been aboard, but there was never a response. DeVoe then checked a few of the living quarters, likely expecting to find bodies, but there were no dead nor living to be found. Next, DeVoe checked the hold for water in the chance the crew may have panicked and believed they were sinking. However, he only measured about 3.5 feet of water in the hold, which is a little bit more than typical, but not enough that anyone on the Mary Celeste would have thought the ship was in danger of sinking. Now, DeVoe was still curious as to why that much water was in the hold to begin with, especially since there was no damage to the ship's hull. Once he came back topside, DeVoe actually noticed that nearly every hatch, window, and door was open on the ship, which, even after only a few days, could lead a ship to take on a decent volume of water. Near the helm, the man DeVoe brought along with him found the Mary Celeste's binnacle smashed to pieces. Now, a binnacle is basically like this vertical case that holds... It's like a vertical storage case that holds like sailing instruments, like your spyglass and your compass and all that. DeVoe joined the man and found the ship's compass broken nearby of the binnacle. He then investigated the ship's wheel, and again, he found it strange. The wheel he found strange because it wasn't tied. So apparently, if a ship captain back in this time, if a captain decided to abandon his ship, they would tell the helmsman, who basically is the guy in charge of steering the ship, they would tell him to tie the wheel down either all the way to the left or all the way to the right. So the ship would kind of just go in circles until it eventually just sank. After that, DeVoe left the other man and began checking the rest of the living quarters, eventually coming across the captain's quarters. Now, according to DeVoe, besides being damp from the water that was pretty much everywhere, the captain's quarters were exceptionally neat. In the room, he also discovered a dress and some children's toys, which led him to believe the captain of the vessel had brought his wife and child along for the voyage, which, of course, we know is true. In the first mate's quarters, DeVoe found a few different logs, but nothing that really indicated what could have happened to the Mary Celeste. However, in the main cabin, he finally found a log that provided at least some useful information. The log contained observations and locations recorded by multiple crew members throughout the voyage. And although an entry was made for November 25th, which was about 9 days before they discovered this ship, it contained no actual notes and was the final date in the log. From the notes available, it seemed Mary Celeste hadn't encountered any trouble and was running perfectly on schedule. The last coordinates in the log placed the Mary Celeste 5 or 6 miles northeast of Santa Maria Island in the Azores, nearly 400 miles from where the vessel was now. From everything he'd kind of seen so far, DeVoe began to suspect that the crew had abandoned the ship during a storm, but what he found next casted some doubt on that theory. From everything he'd kind of seen so far, DeVoe began to suspect that the crew had abandoned the ship during a storm, but what he found next casted some doubt on that theory. As he checked and rechecked the quarters, he noticed that not a single member of the Mary Celeste crew had taken their foul weather gear. Now, this is even weirder when you consider that during the winter, storms are pretty frequent in the Atlantic, and most sailors would constantly wear their foul weather gear. This was the weirdness of this was added on when he noticed that pretty much every member of the crew appeared to have left multiple personal items behind, including items that would have been brought along even in an emergency. Lastly, DeVoe noted that there were no lifeboats on board the Mary Celeste. DeVoe and the other man finished searching every inch of the Mary Celeste in a little over 30 minutes. I think it's easy to say it was a confusing and mysterious scene, but as the men returned to their lifeboat and paddled back to the Di Gratia, DeVoe couldn't care less about the mystery. Instead, when it came to the Mary Celeste, all DeVoe saw was an opportunity to make some extra cash. When DeVoe and the men returned to the Di Gratia, DeVoe personally reported their findings to Morehouse, and he explained the odd state of the Mary Celeste, but put a lot more emphasis on the unusually good condition of the ship and her completely untouched cargo. Once he was done recapping the findings, DeVoe insisted that they should take the Mary Celeste with them to Gibraltar and return her as salvage. So, according to maritime law, any abandoned vessel can be returned to a port, claimed as salvage, and the salver will receive an estimate for what the ship and cargo are worth. Once that estimate is made, the owner of the salvage vessel has to pay that price to the salver to recover their ship and cargo. Now, if the owner refuses to pay the price, ownership of both the vessel and cargo is transferred to the salver. As I said, the Mary Celeste was in relatively good condition, and her cargo was in pristine condition. From his estimate, DeVoe believes that the Mary Celeste was worth anywhere between $40,000 to $50,000 in and of itself, and the cargo would bring that price to somewhere around $80,000. Despite this, Morehouse wasn't really fond of the idea of dragging an additional ship to Gibraltar. For the Di Gratia, the weather during the voyage had been difficult at times. This was in addition to the fact that the Di Gratia was already understaffed with only 8 members of her crew. Taking the Mary Celeste would split that down into 2 groups on a voyage that was still a week from Gibraltar. Morehouse eventually agreed to the plan because he too knew the profit earned from salvaging the Mary Celeste could be life-changing for every member of his crew. Morehouse approved DeVoe and 2 others to take control of the Mary Celeste, and after making some repairs throughout the day, the Mary Celeste and the Di Gratia resumed their voyage to Gibraltar just before midnight on December 4th, 1872. When DeVoe awoke the following morning and looked out at the ocean, he began to wonder what actually happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste. Now, while DeVoe and his 2 mates had a difficult time sailing, nothing eventful really occurred before the vessel arrived in Gibraltar on December 13th, 1872. The Di Gratia had arrived the day before, and Morehouse had alerted the port authorities that his crew would be bringing in a derelict ship. As the Mary Celeste pulled into port, Morehouse noticed that DeVoe didn't appear as eager as before. After docking, Thomas Vecchio, a marshal of the British Vice Admiralty Court, took custody of the Mary Celeste, and soon after, the Admiralty Court scheduled a salvage hearing for December 18th, 1872. Now, DeVoe was hopeful about the hearing and was excited to recover some of his energy over the next few days. In a letter to his wife, he discussed how lucky he felt to have found the Mary Celeste and was confident he would be paid pretty handsomely for her salvage. Now, unfortunately for him, DeVoe had no personal experience with salvage hearings, nor did he know that both the Mary Celeste and her cargo were insured, which would immediately cut the salvage price in half for both things. On Wednesday, December 18th, 1872, the salvage hearings began in the court of Sir James Cochrane, and the hearing was conducted by Frederick Flood. Flood was the Attorney General of Gibraltar and was, according to nearly everybody, a very curmudgeonly old man. In what would be one of the most surprising moments from DeVoe's point of view, Flood called him to testify instead of Morehouse. DeVoe figured as the captain, Morehouse would serve as the main witness and testify for the derelict find, but Morehouse actually wasn't even initially scheduled to testify. Instead, DeVoe, John Wright, John Johnson, Charles Lund, and Augustus Anderson were all set to take the stand on the very first day. John Wright is the man I talked about earlier who did the initial investigation of the Mary Celeste with DeVoe. John Johnson was the man who stayed behind in the lifeboat while the other two investigated. And lastly, Charles Lund and Augustus Anderson were the two who sailed with DeVoe on the Celeste during the voyage to Gibraltar. However, DeVoe would become the main focus of these hearings. DeVoe was the first man to be called to the stand, and almost immediately, Flood made it clear he suspected there was something more sinister at play here. As DeVoe recounted the De Gratia's voyage, their discovery of the Mary Celeste, and their investigation, Flood would kind of occasionally interject with very accusatory questions. After DeVoe's testimony, it was clear that neither Flood nor anyone else in the court was satisfied with his testimony and was growing suspicious of the crew of the De Gratia. However, DeVoe's first time on the stand took up the whole day, so the court adjourned until Friday, December 20th. That day, Flood picked up right where he left off with DeVoe. DeVoe once again recounted the events of the De Gratia and the Mary Celeste. He also took the time to correct some mistakes he had made recounting the story 2 days earlier. Now, in just trying to fix his timeline, Flood believed DeVoe was actually trying to change the story, and he began throwing more accusatory questions and suspicions his way. However, DeVoe remained calm and was finally excused after a day and a half of testifying. After this, Wright was called to the stand and recounted the events exactly as DeVoe had before him. Unlike with DeVoe, Flood reserved his questions and Wright was quickly dismissed. Next up was Charles Lund, and with him, Flood went back on the attack, and everyone began to notice something about the crew of the De Gratia. They seemingly had no clue that Flood was very, very obviously insinuating that the men may have murdered the crew of the Mary Celeste and stole her ship, or stole this ship. Now, to Flood, the salvage of the vessel didn't matter as much as discovering what happened to the crew aboard the Mary Celeste, but unless they were fantastic actors, the crew of the De Gratia had no idea what happened to them either. Once again, the court was still without a solid answer, and the trial would continue into the weekend. On Saturday, December 21st, Anderson and Johnson were both called to the stand. Like DeVoe and Wright, Anderson laid out the events, and his story aligned with theirs. Johnson spent little time on the stand because he was a native Russian, and he spoke in very broken English, which irritated Flood. By the end of the day, Flood argued that the men of the De Gratia were withholding evidence from the court. Specifically, Flood was arguing that they were withholding the log detailing the Mary Celeste location that the men found in the hold. But in actuality, Judge Cochran already had the log, and had Flood asked for it, he could have used it. This led the judge and Flood to get into an argument, which led to Flood and some members of the De Gratia getting into an argument. But after everyone shut up, the testimonies ended, but the case still wasn't over. Judge Cochran said Mary Celeste would remain in custody until there was more evidence of what actually transpired on her. Obviously, Flood was convinced that foul play was afoot. Following 3 days of testimonies and his disability to bring this case to a close, Flood was aggravated and determined to prove his theory. So, on Monday, December 23rd, Flood hired the surveyor of shipping, John Austin, to re-inspect the Mary Celeste. He also hired a professional diver named Ricardo Portunato to investigate the ship's hull, which means some part of Flood did believe this may have been an accident. However, the media did not share this idea. By this point, news of Mary Celeste's supposed abandonment and the salvage hearing had already reached New York City, and, as the media tends to do, they took the most fantastical and dramatic explanation as truth. Soon, there were reports coming out claiming that murder was a certainty on the Mary Celeste, and that the alcohol she was shipping was the cause of it. A few hours before the inspection of Mary Celeste began, Morehouse sent every member of his crew off on Di Grazia to finish their intended delivery to Genoa, or Genoa. Again, not Italian. Look at me. He knew doing this during an active investigation would be unwise, but he still had a family and customers to take care of. During his inspection, the first thing Austin noticed was deep cuts on both sides of Mary Celeste's bow. Interestingly, according to Austin, these cuts were far too precise to have been caused by weather damage. Instead, he concluded that these cuts could only have been made intentionally with a sharp object. While on the ship, Austin determined that it was nearly impossible for foul weather to have led to the crew's demise. His reports indicated that the sails were damaged, but not in the typical manner weather would damage them. Oddly, after conducting a full sweep of the ship, Austin noted that the Celeste hadn't suffered nearly as much water damage as the crew of the Di Grazia had described. And lastly, most importantly, Austin found the captain's sword in his quarters. Now, when he unsheathed the sword, he observed that it hadn't been damaged by water, but did appear to be smeared with blood, or it looked like at one point it had been smeared with blood. Someone wiped it clean and then resheathed the sword. The sword was all Flood needed to confirm his earlier suspicions. Murder had taken place aboard the Mary Celeste. However, Flood no longer really believed the crew of the Di Grazia was behind the act. Instead, his new theory was that the crew of the Mary Celeste had mutinied against their captain, killed him, and then fled the vessel. To further solidify this opinion, Flood conducted his own inspection of Mary Celeste to find any additional evidence. Now, unlike Austin, Flood took even the most minor damages as evidence for his narrative. Every little nick on the Mary Celeste was now attributed to a sharp weapon. Now, regarding more substantial evidence, Flood discovered what he believed to be blood on the ship's deck. Additionally, he found deeper gouges on a section of the vessel's handrails that appeared to have been made with an axe. However, it was the suspected blood that intrigued Flood the most. After his investigation, he had a doctor take a sample of it to confirm if it was actually blood. Down in the cargo hold, Flood, unlike anyone else, believed some of the barrels of alcohol had been tampered with. So, on January 22nd, 1873, Flood sent a letter to the Board of Trade in London requesting a more in-depth investigation. In the letter, Flood laid out his theory of what had transpired. He believed that the crew of the Mary Celeste had broken into the barrels of alcohol and, in a drunken stupor, murdered the Briggs family. They then threw the bodies overboard, and after realizing what they had done, began cutting away at sections of the vessel to sort of make it look as if there had been either a storm damage, or basically just to make the ship look damaged and make it look like there was a good reason why a captain would order the ship to be abandoned. Lastly, while Flood didn't believe anymore that the crew of the Di Grazia was behind the murders, he still didn't accept most of their story. Specifically, Flood didn't believe that they found the Mary Celeste where they said they did, because he found it completely impossible for the ship to have drifted as far as it did between November 25th, when it was supposedly abandoned, and December 4th, when it was discovered. A week before that letter was sent, on January 15th, James Winchester arrived in Gibraltar. Now, he had hoped that the whole situation could have been handled without his direct involvement, but the murder theory destroyed those chances. But he was still hopeful that the Mary Celeste would be released soon and finally finish her delivery. On January 29th, the court reconvened for the salvage hearings and witnessed a very fierce set of exchanges between Winchester and Flood. From the very beginning, both men were extremely spiteful toward each other. As you can imagine, Flood was responsible for starting these arguments because, as he did with the crew of the Di Grazia, he began to grill Winchester about everything and would occasionally throw in an accusation or two. The two argued for hours, but eventually Flood got the upper hand when he described the damage to the rails. Because when Mary Celeste left New York, Winchester stated that the rails were in perfect condition. 2 days later, Winchester was once again on the stand, and now he too did believe something suspicious had happened on the Mary Celeste. Now, on that day, Winchester admitted that all the evidence pointed to the idea that something mysterious had happened to the crew. However, he still refuted the idea that murder was behind the mystery. Finally, as all previous investigators had determined, Winchester agreed that the Mary Celeste hadn't suffered near enough damage that would warrant someone like Benjamin Briggs abandoning her. Flood had no interest in what Winchester had to say, and soon told Winchester that he didn't have the appropriate paperwork to reclaim Mary Celeste. Without the paperwork, Winchester would be required to pay bail to release the vessel, as well as cover all of the court's salvage expenses. All in all, these costs would amount to somewhere around $15,000 in 1873 money. Although he did want to argue this price, he had no leverage and eventually agreed to pay the fine, but Winchester didn't have $15,000 at the time, which meant that the Mary Celeste would remain in Gibraltar until he could pay. About a month later, Winchester returned to New York, and in a letter to Horatio Sprague, who was the American consul in Gibraltar at the time, Winchester confided in him that he chose to leave Gibraltar earlier than planned because he'd heard rumors that Flood and Cochrane were beginning to believe that Winchester had hired a crew to take out the Briggs family. Speaking of Sprague, he shared Winchester's belief that something mysterious did actually happen to the crew, but it wasn't murder. Behind Cochrane and Flood's backs, Sprague hired Captain Schufelt of the U.S. Navy to conduct yet another inspection of the Mary Celeste. Interestingly, Schufelt had been part of another investigation where a ship had been mysteriously abandoned, and he was pretty crucial in solving that case. So, Sprague had high hopes that Schufelt would work his magic, and Schufelt arrived in Gibraltar on February 5th, conducted his investigation, and then left the very next day. In his report, Schufelt simply stated that the crew had prematurely abandoned the vessel. However, Schufelt made a point to mention that the entire crew had left the vessel, which meant Briggs and his family had willingly left Mary Celeste at the same time as everyone else. Regarding the cuts across the ship, Schufelt concluded that there was nothing suspicious about any of them, noting that these were very common damages for newly fitted ships. This point speaks to Schufelt's knowledge because no one had told him that Mary Celeste was newly refitted. Toward the end of the report, Schufelt sort of nonchalantly called Austin and Flood idiots for not noticing the same things he did. To finish the letter, Schufelt stated that he hoped that a ship would come across the survivors and that they would be delivered to a port safe and sound. However, the Mary Celeste had already been found 2 months prior, and with no word of them, nearly everyone believed the crew was long since dead. Schufelt's conclusion dealt a major blow to Flood's conspiracy theory, which had already suffered a significant setback a few days earlier. If you recall, Flood had ordered a doctor to take blood samples from the vessel. The doctor, known as Dr. Patrone, concluded that not a single sample was blood. Flood's theory continued to crumble when the Mary Celeste was investigated again by Thomas Vecchio, who was, if you remember, the man who initially impounded her. Vecchio's main point of concern was the alcohol and the alleged tampering. However, after removing a number of the barrels, it became evident that not a single barrel had been touched or opened. This was the nail in the coffin for Flood's case, and on February 25th, 1873, he reluctantly agreed to release the Mary Celeste back to Winchester. However, just because the criminal case had ended, that didn't mean the salvage hearing was finished. Flood and Cochrane were aware that the Di Grazia had departed back in December without Morehouse. From that point forward, Cochrane also became convinced that the crew of the Di Grazia couldn't be trusted. So, in a last-ditch effort to blame somebody for what happened, Flood went back on the attack when the salvage hearings resumed in early March. For the conclusion of the hearings, DeVoe returned to Gibraltar alone, likely on the recommendation of Morehouse, who feared having the Di Grazia impounded like the Mary Celeste was. Although Flood planned to rehash all of his original accusations, DeVoe came prepared and used all of the subsequent findings in his defense. None of Flood's old tricks were working, even when Morehouse was finally called to the stand. When asked about what happened, Morehouse's story matched his crewmates' stories perfectly, and finally Cochrane dismissed the case and announced he would deliver his verdict on March 11th. The day before the expected verdict, the Mary Celeste finally departed from Gibraltar, captained by George Blatchford. Blatchford had been in Gibraltar for nearly a month and was anticipating the ship's release. However, there was a bit of a problem. Most men no longer wanted to sail on the vessel out of fear that it was cursed. It took Blatchford 3 weeks to fully staff the Mary Celeste, but she finally departed for Genoa on March 10th. As for the verdict, it came 3 days later than promised on March 14th, 1873. In an extremely brief statement, Cochrane awarded the crew of the Dei Gratia a mere $8,000, which was only about 18% of what the court had agreed the salvage was worth. In this statement, Cochrane made it clear that he didn't believe the crew of the Dei Gratia deserved anything, and also stated that they would have to pay for the case's expenses out of their reward. Over the following decade, before Cochrane's death, he and Flood continued to insinuate that something sinister had happened aboard the Mary Celeste, and that the crew of the Dei Gratia were somehow involved. Eventually, the papers circled back to blaming the crew for the missing crew of the Mary Celeste, and the men remained guilty in the court of public opinion for the remainder of their lives. As for the Mary Celeste, she returned to Boston early September 1873. She slunk into the harbor without any sort of celebration, and the crew was shortly relieved. Now, typically when a ship delivers her cargo, the captain finds a shipment to bring back. However, after the Mary Celeste delivered the shipment of alcohol, no one was interested in hiring her. The Mary Celeste was a sensation by that point, but for all the wrong reasons. Upon her return, Winchester knew she was becoming a money pit and wanted to get rid of her, so he put her up for sale. But no one was interested. Not a single buyer showed any interest in her, and she simply sat abandoned for the next few weeks. Winchester figured he might have better luck selling her in New York, so he hired a crew to sail her down the coast. According to Winchester, when the vessel arrived in the city, many people would be very interested in her until they learned that it was the Mary Celeste and learned about her history. This was the state of the Mary Celeste for the next 5 months before she was finally purchased by a shipping partnership known as Cartwright and Harrison. The duo stationed the Mary Celeste in the West Indies, where it continuously lost money. Additionally, the ship continued to point toward the idea that it was cursed. Shipments of lumber would randomly fall overboard. A shipment of horses was caught in a storm where nearly all the horses died, and during a return voyage to America in 1879, the captain, Edgar Tuthill, quickly and mysteriously fell ill. The Mary Celeste made an emergency stop on the island of St. Helena to search for a doctor, but after 3 weeks, Tuthill died, bringing the vessel's count of doomed captains to 3. After this, Mary Celeste remained in action for another year under Cartwright and Harrison before they eventually sold her at a disgustingly low price just to get rid of her. Later, David Cartwright himself would claim that the ship was seemingly cursed and that he'd never encountered a vessel with more misfortune. The man who purchased the ship was named Wesley Gove, who, to his credit, did try to turn the Celeste's luck around. She was captained by Thomas Fleming until, in 1884, Gove replaced Fleming with a man named Gilman Parker. Now, as I said, Gove did try to make the Mary Celeste successful, but he too failed. She continuously lost money, and proved to be an investment that risked ruining him. Now, despite both of those things, I'm not certain Gove was complicit in what happened next. Sometime in November 1884, Parker conspired with some shippers in Boston who filled the ship with practically worthless cargo, but listed as more exotic exports. Additionally, Parker ensured that all of the cargo was 100% covered by insurance. Once the ship was loaded, she set off on December 16, 1884, for Port-au-Prince, Haiti. On January 3, 1885, the Mary Celeste was approaching the port. Now, between the coast and this port laid a harsh but pretty well-charted coral reef. However, Parker made no mention of the reef to his crew, and the Mary Celeste plowed directly into it. The vessel quickly came to a violent halt, which caused her foremast to snap completely off, and a large portion of her hull was ripped to shreds. Within seconds, the Mary Celeste was fatally damaged. Afterward, Parker ordered the launching of the lifeboats, and he and his men rowed to the mainland. Now, upon landing, Parker found the American consul in Haiti, told him that there had been a horrible accident, and offered to sell whatever cargo the man could salvage for $500. Parker said that the crew didn't care about the cargo, and all they wanted was to go home. The man couldn't pass up a deal like this, and paid Parker, who afterward quickly sent a telegram saying that the Mary Celeste had been lost. After receiving the telegram, Gove claimed the 100% loss of the ship to the insurance companies. However, once the consul inspected the cargo he'd bought, he knew he'd been scammed. Fortunately, an insurance surveyor was in Haiti inspecting another vessel at the time, and was brought in to take a look at the Mary Celeste. To quickly summarize what happened next, I'm not going to go through another whole court case or anything. The surveyor opened an insurance fraud investigation. The first mate eventually confessed to the scheme, and every member of the Mary Celeste was arrested on returning to Boston and were awaiting trial on counts of insurance fraud. In July 1885, Parker, his crew, and the shippers were all put on trial for insurance fraud. However, Parker faced an additional charge of barratry, which is a maritime crime where a captain, either through misconduct or on purpose, endangers an entire ship and or her cargo or her, the crew. Now, at the time, a conviction for barratry could result in capital punishment. The insurance fraud trial came first, and every member of the Mary Celeste and the shippers were found guilty, except for Parker. The jury hesitated to deliver a guilty verdict for Parker, because they were concerned that it might influence the outcome of his capital trial. To avoid going through a retrial, the judge encouraged a guilty verdict by ordering that everyone revert their insurance claims, and they personally repay any of the money they received. This strategy worked. Parker was found guilty of insurance fraud, subsequently convicted of barratry, and was initially expected to receive capital punishment. However, this sentence was eventually deferred, and Parker was actually allowed to walk free. As for the Mary Celeste, soon after the trial ended, she was still stuck on that reef off the coast of Haiti. Eventually, officials set her on fire, which caused her to break apart, and she sank to the depths. However, in her death, she let out what would pretty much be one last gasp of doom, because 3 months after his sentence deferral, Parker, who had slipped into poverty, suddenly and mysteriously died. One of the other men who sailed with Parker literally went insane, and another unnamed member of the Mary Celeste's final crew committed suicide. With the deaths of these 3 men, the Mary Celeste had claimed her final victims. Of course, the disappearance of the Briggs family and their crew is the main focus of this story. However, in my opinion, I find that the events before and after their vanishing are just as significant, because they sort of suggest that there might have been more to this small little vessel built in Nova Scotia than meets the eye. Now, unlike the disappearance, these events are better understood and cohesive. The unexplained mystery has spawned numerous theories and possible explanations. So let's explore some of these theories, and as usual, I'll share my conclusion on which one I believe. Much like Flood, many people over the years have believed that murder and or crime were responsible for the Mary Celeste. The most popular theories include piracy, mutiny, and insurance fraud. Firstly, let's talk about the pirate thing. I, under no circumstance, believe that the Mary Celeste was attacked by pirates. If you recall, not only was the vessel in good condition, but her cargo was completely untouched. Additionally, all of the crew's valuables were left behind, which is pretty inconsistent with the typical behavior of pirates. Next, when it comes to mutiny, I find this explanation just as unbelievable as the pirate thing, because Briggs was known to be a beloved and respected captain. However, due to some of the varying reports about some of the barrels of alcohol being opened, some believe alcohol led the crew to murder their captain. There is a bit of a problem with this theory, though. The alcohol Mary Celeste was transporting was not your typical alcohol you drink. It was either likely ethanol or methanol. Undrinkable alcohol. So drunken sailors overthrowing their captain is pretty much out of the question. As for insurance fraud, We know she did end up in a similar situation in the future, but how would that explain Briggs's disappearance? Well, I briefly mentioned that some people believe Winchester hired a crew who would off the Briggs family and then escape via the lifeboat. Then, once the ship was found abandoned, Winchester could file the insurance claims for the cargo. Again, this theory has some really big problems attached to it. Firstly, there is literally no evidence for this. Flood and others tried to say that the cargo was overinsured, but actually the claims were very right on point for the time. As for the supposed plot of murder, this theory was built upon the idea that blood was found on a sword and on the deck, which we now know was not blood. Now, what about the possibility that Briggs himself was a part of this scheme? Some theorized that maybe Briggs and Morehouse coordinated the idea of abandoning Mary Celeste and then discovering her abandoned. Then, when Morehouse received the salvage reward, he would split it with Briggs. All I really have to say about this theory is why? Why would someone like Briggs take part in a scheme like this? Salvaging the ship for financial gain makes no sense for Briggs. He'd make way more money just by delivering the cargo normally. Well, then what about the idea that maybe Briggs and his family just wanted to intentionally disappear? Why would he do this? The purpose of Briggs' investment in the Mary Celeste was that she would allow him to bring his family along, and when he couldn't, her size would equate to less time at sea. It makes no sense, especially when you consider that Briggs' son Arthur was left behind for the doomed voyage. So, unless they plan to intentionally turn their son into an orphan, I'd say that this theory is probably pretty impossible too. The Mary Celeste was neither the first nor the last ghost ship of its kind. What makes it so famous, though, obviously, is that the Mary Celeste is one of the few that remains unexplained and appears with pretty much no evidence for what happened to her. As you'd expect, most ghost ships are the result of foul weather, which causes their crew to abandon them. Quick side note, if you didn't know, the term ghost ship does have two meanings. Sometimes it does refer to a literal ghost ship, akin to something like the Flying Dutchman. However, most often, ghost ship is just a catch-all term for a ship found abandoned. So, if we're to believe that Mary Celeste suffered the same fate as many other ghost ships, we have to consider that she fell victim to foul weather. However, as we know, after multiple inspections, everyone agreed that while she did have minor indications of weather damage, it wasn't nearly enough to believe an experienced captain like Benjamin Briggs would willingly abandon her. But it is possible that maybe an incredible yet dangerous weather phenomenon had occurred. A waterspout. In simplest terms, a waterspout is essentially a tornado that occurs over water. Like regular tornadoes, waterspouts vary in intensity, ranging from relatively harmless to potentially deadly. Those that are classified as more on the harmless side typically form and dissipate quickly, and are usually only accompanied by strong winds. Stronger waterspouts are the more intense variety of tornadoes that you might be used to seeing on like the news and stuff, because they can bring severe weather phenomenon, like thunderstorms, hail, and they also have the ability to lift objects. Regardless of their strength, all waterspouts are marked by a drop in barometric pressure. An intriguing aspect is that this pressure, barometric pressure, when it drops, it can lead to a sudden rise of sea levels. Considering this, I think it's possible that after encountering a waterspout, Briggs checked the water level in the hold but got an inaccurate measurement due to the rise caused by the waterspout. Believing the vessel might be sinking, he ordered the single lifeboat to be launched and abandoned ship. Subsequently, during their journey, the lifeboat may have encountered another waterspout or storm, leading to its failure and the tragic loss of the crew, who were eventually engulfed by the waves and were never seen again. Beyond the waterspout hypothesis, several other weather-related theories have been proposed. These include suggestions of an accidental collision with a coral reef, maybe they were impacted by a rogue wave, or maybe there was a potential encounter with a drifting iceberg in the Atlantic. However, it's worth noting that both a rogue wave and a collision with a coral reef would likely result in more significant and unmistakable damage to the ship's structure. Similarly, an encounter with an iceberg would have left noticeable damage, and the presence of such a large iceberg in the region would likely have been reported. So, since the Mary Celeste defies all simple explanations, some believe in a more drastic set of circumstances. Mainly, the Mary Celeste has been used as a token of proof that something strange is happening in the Bermuda Triangle. Now, if you're not aware, the Bermuda Triangle is off the eastern coast of Florida. And if you recall, the Mary Celeste was found midway between the Azores and Portugal. That being said, it is absolutely crazy to me that people use the Mary Celeste as proof of strange occurrences in the Bermuda Triangle when she was over 3,000 miles away. This is the problem I have when everything has to be paranormal. And, you know, I say this obviously as someone that has a few paranormal beliefs. When you attribute something like the disappearance of the Mary Celeste crew to the Bermuda Triangle, it weakens the actual story and confuses anyone who's interested because you're blaming the event on something that's entirely unrelated. It doesn't really help either because this is a maritime mystery, because those usually have the misfortune of getting sucked into a cesspool of boredom known as the Bermuda Triangle. And yeah, I said it, the Bermuda Triangle is boring. When you blame everything on it, it's stupid. This happened over 3,000 miles away, and you're going to say that this Bermuda Triangle is pulling the ship that far and it just spits it back over in Portugal. It's so stupid. I hate the Bermuda Triangle. Anyways, other paranormal theories commonly brought up are aliens and some kind of sea monster like the Kraken. However, there's no evidence for either of these theories, and in my opinion, neither of those really make sense anyways. So, what do I think happened here? Well, in actuality, I actually think that two, maybe even three things were at play when it came to the Mary Celeste. As for the disappearance, I think a water spout makes the most sense. I believe it was a weather phenomenon that caused Briggs and the crew to abandon the ship. And of the plausible weather theories, a water spout checks the most boxes. As I said earlier, water spouts can be potentially fatal, but I actually think the crew encountered one of them that are on the weaker side. If they had encountered a stronger water spout, the vessel would have shown much more damage than the minor damage that was actually present. What I think happened is that the water spout formed somewhere near the Mary Celeste. But this, in and of itself, probably wouldn't have caused Briggs to panic, because him being an experienced sailor, he most likely knew what a water spout was. However, I think it is possible that this weaker spout caused the minor damage present on the vessel, and after the spout dissipated, sort of as a precaution, Briggs measured the level of water in the hold. Remember, these spouts can cause a rapid increase in sea level, so it's possible that getting a high water level reading from the hold caused Briggs to panic. Believing the ship may now be sinking, he may have ordered the launching of the singular lifeboat. Okay, well, that brings up the problem of why didn't they eventually, wash up on shore or end up on a vessel somewhere? Well, as it turns out, something else water spouts can do is occasionally they can cause storm clusters to form. So, after they abandoned the Mary Celeste, they may have been caught in an intense storm. Now, of course, storms are potentially deadly to vessels even larger than the Mary Celeste was, so you can probably imagine what they would do to a lifeboat. So I think a water spout forced the crew off the ship one way or another, and they were eventually lost to the waves while in the lifeboat. But I did say I think there was more than one thing at play here. While I do think a water spout finished the job, so to speak, I think something more unnatural may have been responsible for everything that occurred. I would not really consider myself a spiritual individual, and try my best to approach everything I talk about, and pretty much everything in my life, with a sort of skeptical view. So keep that in mind when I say that I believe both the Mary Celeste and the Briggs family were cursed. As I mentioned, I'm not spiritual, and the idea of curses falls into the realm of things I am particularly skeptical of. However, when I look at this whole story, it's hard for me not to feel as if there was something unnatural, at least playing a minor part of this story. From her very first launch as the Amazon, the vessel brought seemingly nothing but ruin and misfortune to everyone around her. 3 of her captains died, her owners were always financially negative because of her, and even when she finally sank to the depths of the ocean, she seemingly dragged more people to hell with her. This was even the opinion of relatives of Benjamin Briggs. One of his nephews, James Briggs, later said that Mary Celeste wasn't a good name for the vessel. Remember, Mary Celeste means Heavenly Mary. Instead, he said the vessel should have been named the Mary Diablesse, which means Mary the She-Devil, which goes so hard. But speaking of this Briggs family, I think they themselves might have been cursed too. Much like the Mary Celeste, when you look at the story, it's obvious to see why I think this way. While accidents and deaths weren't at all uncommon at the time, the number of Briggs family members who were lost at sea was rather high. Then consider Nathan, Benjamin's father, who was the most experienced. He survived his tenure at sea, he retired and settled down at home, only to get struck by lightning and die. Also, remember Oliver Briggs, Benjamin's brother? The last time we talked about him, he had just arrived in New York, and he had just missed the departure of the Mary Celeste. Well, anyways, around the new year of 1873, Oliver was still unaware that his brother's vessel had been found abandoned, so he took what was supposed to be his final voyage before retiring. The shipment was for Gijón, Spain, and the initial voyage went perfectly. However, on the return voyage, the ship was destroyed in a storm, and despite trying to stay afloat on a piece of wreckage, Oliver eventually just succumbed to hypothermia in the freezing Atlantic waters. All in all, I think a very cursed individual, Benjamin Briggs, went aboard a very cursed vessel, the Mary Celeste, and they combined to create the mystery we know now. As I said earlier, I think a waterspout is what caused the disappearance, but the combination of those two curses led to the forming of that waterspout. Whew. I know I always say it, but I get into these topics, and I don't expect to get into them as much as I thought I would, and then I just go crazy. And this was one of those ones. This was one that I've always wanted to kind of talk about, but I didn't really think there was as much mystery to it as everyone kind of said there was. Also, if you're here just for the Mary Celeste stuff, that part's over. This is just going to be my rambling kind of personal thoughts about the story, and then kind of an update about what's going on. But yeah, I get into these topics, and then I don't think I'm going to go as in-depth as I do, and then I end up making hour and a half long videos on stuff that I'd never expected to really take that long. Well, like certain stuff like, the Ouija board and the Dyatlov Pass, I knew those were going to be big ones when I was going into it. But some of these topics I go in and go, oh, that'd be an easy thing to talk about. It shouldn't take too long. I'm not going to have to work that long on an outline for it, and then I just get stuck into it. And that's not me complaining. I love this stuff. I love working on this stuff. And now I have more time to actually work on it. It might get a little weird here soon because my girlfriend and I are actually we're looking for a house right now. And we're getting pretty close to being able to buy a house. So, if you watch me on here and you're subscribed to me, I always post kind of what's going on in my community tab. I do have socials. I have a Twitter and Instagram, but I never post on them. The easiest way to kind of keep up with what I'm doing is just those community posts I put on here. My Instagram doesn't get used at all, and my Twitter is basically me just talking about video games, usually. I do that pretty rarely too. I don't like going on there that much. But to keep up to date with what's kind of going on, I always just look on here on the community tab. It's crazy. I just got an update not too long ago that I've had this channel for 2 years now, and that is crazy to me. And it's hard for me to put into perspective how much I've actually done on here, because it doesn't feel like I've done a lot. But when I take in how much I have to research these videos, and I have to record and I have to edit, and I do this all still while working a full-time job. Luckily, the job I got a few months ago was a lot easier for me to work on this stuff than my old job. I used to work at Walmart. I used to push carts at Walmart. I was always exhausted doing that. I'd do that 40 hours a week and come home and have no time to work on this. The job I have now warrants me a lot more time to work on this stuff. I'm not as tired when I get home. So I have a lot more time to actually sit down and focus on this, which is the stuff that I absolutely love doing. I was actually going to make a video before this one about a topic. I don't really want to spoil it. I try to keep like what I'm working on kind of secret until the day before it's coming out. But there was supposed to be one before this. I made like half of an outline for it, and then as I was working on it, I kind of lost interest, so I figured I would just work on this one, and then I got really stuck into this one. So that's why this one ended up coming out first. I already have the next couple videos kind of planned. One of which is I'm thinking about starting a new series on the channel. Again, I'm not going to spoil anything because I'm not even sure that it's going to play out the way I want it to. But I have an idea for a new series on this channel. That should be pretty fun if it works out the way I'm hoping it works out. As of right now, though, everything's kind of up in the air because I know with us looking for a house right now, my girlfriend and I are going to be moving a lot of stuff around. And at some point, I'm going to have to take all my computer stuff apart and all that, and I'm not going to be able to record or really research on anything. I can still research on stuff, but I just can't record or edit or anything. So I want to get at least... I want to get this... I know this video will go out before moving happens. But I want to get at least one more video out before we move. Nothing's set in stone yet. I mean, I'm saying like, oh, we're moving. Nothing's really set in stone yet. We're still in the very early phases of it, so it could be 2 months we're moving, or it could be 6 months. It could be a year. I don't know. It's kind of all up in the air right now, but yeah, it's been fun working on this stuff, and I really enjoyed working on this one. And I'm glad you all are still supporting the channel. I know I don't have the most consistent upload schedule, but like I said, I still do work a full-time job. There's only so many days I can spend on this. But your all support has been amazing. I think the Dyatlov video is creeping up to nearly 1,000 views, which is crazy. And I think last I checked, I think it was the Hopkinsville Goblins video from a year or so ago, was up to almost 3,800 the last I checked, which is absolutely insane to me. As I've been working on this stuff, the Hopkinsville video is a weird one. Yeah, I've talked about it in the past. I'm not gonna really go into it, but that was one of my more like loose kind of videos. That was more one that I didn't really expect to do as well as it did, because it was kind of a weird niche topic, and also I was kind of in the middle of readjusting everything. But what I've taken from that video is that maybe the more like loose stuff is kind of what you all like, and I'm kind of getting more comfortable with the way I'm talking. Like I'll be honest here, I mean, behind you all, or technically in front of you all, I use a teleprompter that keeps me on topic with where we are in my stuff, like my outlines and stuff. And one thing in the Hopkinsville video was, I believe that was the very first episode where I used a teleprompter, and I just read the prompter word by word, which I didn't really like that I did that, because that's never what I've really wanted to do. But back then I was a lot more uncomfortable with talking to a camera still. But as I've made videos and I've kind of gotten used to using the teleprompter, and it kind of just keeps me on topic, I've gotten better at like kind of improving my own stuff, and talking more loosely, talking organically, I guess would be the best way to say it. Because when I was doing the Hopkinsville video and even like the Flatwoods video, I sounded very robotic, and I've never wanted to do that, but I think that comes with me. I had to put this blanket up because my cat's tearing up my chair. Ugh. But I think that just comes with me working on this stuff. I would say I've definitely grown since I've started doing this. I'm having so much fun working on it, and I'm hoping you're all enjoying it. But besides that, with the house update and me thanking you all for the continued support, I don't really think I got too much else to say. Yeah, I got nothing. So hopefully more videos on the way soon. Thank you all again for the continued support. I hope you enjoyed this video. And as always, I hope to see you all again very soon.